Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second plenary of this year's Planning and Redevelopment Conference. We hope you enjoyed the first plenary session yesterday, as well as this morning's breakout sessions. We often say that wherever the nation is going, New Jersey will get there first. But as you're soon about to hear, we have a lot to learn from other cities and states around the country. New Jersey Future and APA are very pleased to host this plenary, which examines strategies, including some successes, to produce a wider variety of housing options so that homes are more affordable and neighborhoods are more livable. As keynoter Jeff Otto explained yesterday, New Jersey needs its own breakthroughs if we are to remain a vibrant place for the next generation. I'm Chris Sturm, Policy Director for Land Use at New Jersey Future. Our team works on housing and transportation and land use planning to produce great neighborhoods. This is a critical component of the work that New Jersey Future does to ensure that all of our communities are healthy, strong, and resilient and accessible to every New Jerseyan. It's my honor to kick off today's plenary, Housing Breakthroughs Across the Nation. Once again, special thanks to our title sponsor, PSEG. I also want to acknowledge today's many plenary sponsors: New Jersey's Clean Energy Program, the Rowan University School of Earth and Environment, Connell Foley, Greenbaum Rowe, Smith and Davis, Hackensack Meridian Health, McManaman, Scotland and Bowman, and last but not least, the New Jersey Redevelopment Authority. Before we get started, just a few reminders. As you use social media to share your photos, experiences, and lessons learned, please remember to use the hashtag NJPRC24. At the end of today's plenary, which is live, you will have the opportunity for a Q&A session. Please remember to use the Q&A function to enter your questions as opposed to the chat. And now it is my honor and pleasure to hand it over to Rob Studeville, who is the Senior Communications Advisor at the Congress for New Urbanism and will be moderating this session. Take it away, Rob.
Thank you very much, Chris. I really appreciate it. It's a pleasure to be here today. And although I live in upstate New York, I used to reside in the Garden State. And I had many coming-of-age experiences in New Jersey, but I never found a way to turn these into pop songs. Once I did sleep under the boardwalk, but that's not, it's all it's cracked up to be. At age 6, I walked to school by myself in New Jersey, proving that what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. But here we are today, virtually in New Jersey, a state full of livable cities and towns. And it has a lot to teach the rest of the country. But what we're here to discuss is what's going on with housing around the U.S. and what New Jersey might learn from that. And we are in a period of innovation, of community building and housing. And this is happening at all levels of government, from local to national. And this policy movement has grown considerably over the last 5 years. The degree to which various government levels are responding to the housing situation is new. And yes, there was a smart growth movement that's been around since the late 1990s, but its housing proposals at the time were pretty timid compared to what we see at the state level today. And we're going to hear much more about this, but a variety of states from the smallest to the largest, including so-called blue and red states, are acting to loosen restrictions on building housing. And this includes accessory dwelling units, as well as more broadly missing middle housing types, but also allowing higher densities where there are services like transit. One of the most ambitious new laws is in California, the AB 2011, which provides as-of-right zoning for 8 million dwelling units statewide. These can be built along commercial corridors, often lined by parking lots. California is obviously a very expensive place to build housing, but the housing crisis is nationwide. New Jersey is one of only 7 states where the median housing price tops $500,000. Housing has become so unaffordable, I'm told, that more than 75% of houses in the market are not affordable to middle-income buyers. This is driving some creative solutions at the state and local level. Some of this has been brought about by a growing YIMBY, Yes in My Backyard movement. And this is a welcome pushback to restrictions of housing and density that grew up throughout the 20th century. Not only that, but there were many policies that were adopted that really were not directly about housing, but they had a big impact on housing and housing affordability, like parking mandates. And because of the housing crisis, state and local governments are starting to reverse these policies at a scale that would have been unimaginable 10 years ago, let alone 20 or 30 years ago. While state governments are taking unprecedented action, some local governments are becoming laboratories of innovation, and we have 2 of those cities with us today. All of this activity is beginning to trickle up to the federal government. And yesterday, Senator Fetterman and U.S. Rep. Blunt Rochester co-sponsored the Reducing Regulatory Barriers to Housing Act. And it would direct HUD to assist with zoning and land use, coordinate housing development efforts across the federal government, and research best practices for states to promote housing production. It even mentions the idea of grants for pre-approved house designs. And we'll probably hear something about that from Spokane, which is one of the cities that is pioneering that concept. So first of all, I'm going to introduce the panel. And we have Alyia Gaskins, who is a councilwoman for the city of Alexandria, Virginia. And she is, in her day job, senior program officer at the Melville Charitable Trust, a national philanthropic organization devoted to ending homelessness. Chris Dorrington is director of the Montana Department of Environmental Quality. He is also chair of the governor's housing task force. Ethan Stuckmeyer is manager of the housing division at the Oregon Department of Land Conservation and Development. And he previously worked in affordable housing policy for the state of Oregon and as a private sector planner. Casey Downey is a long-range planner with the city of Spokane, Washington, where much of her work is focused on sustainable and equitable housing policy. She previously worked for the city of Boise, another fast-growing city. And I'm with the Congress for the New Urbanism, and we're a member-based organization based in DC that champions better designs of cities and towns to improve lives and strengthen communities for all. I would like to remind everybody out there that we will be taking Q&A from the audience. So please use the Q&A function of Zoom to ask questions as they occur to you. And with that, I'm going to kick things off by asking folks on the panel to each talk about reform efforts in their jurisdictions. And maybe we can start off with Alyia.
Well, thank you, Rob, and good morning, everyone. I'm Councilwoman Alyia Gaskins, and I'm excited to join you from Alexandria, Virginia. So Alexandria, like many of the places named in the opening, we are facing an affordable housing crisis. We know that access to safe and affordable housing is often hard to find, is scarce, and it's challenging to keep. How do we know that? I think we see it every day in the stories and the conversations we have with our residents, but we also know it from the data in the fact that we're seeing over 7,000 of our renter households who are housing cost burden. We see over 100 cases in our eviction court. We see a number of seniors and increased call volume coming into the city asking where they can find affordable housing. We're seeing waiting lists at our shelters. And so as a council, we wanted to figure out what are the things that we can do to help facilitate an additional supply of housing options in our community. This work actually began in 2020. Like many communities, Alexandria goes through a housing master plan process, which is an opportunity for us to bring together the community to really hear their ideas and thoughts for some of the policies that we should be thinking about. What this then emerged into is our Zoning for Housing, Housing for All initiative. This was a set of 8 different policies ranging from office to residential conversions to all the way to enhancing options in our single family zones. The idea of looking at 8 different policies was because we know no one tool or no one solution is going to address all of our housing needs. We also knew that not only did we want to advance affordability, but we also wanted to advance the availability and the accessibility of housing options across our neighborhoods, and that different policies might do that. So we have other ones in there that look at transit-oriented development. All this came together into about a year-long effort of community engagement, where we talked about each of our 8 policies. We talked about their potential impacts. We talked about community concerns for how we might measure and address them. And then finally, last November, with a unanimous vote of the City Council, all 7 of us voted to pass all 8 of these reforms. And so now we are in the process of figuring out how best to implement them and how we will measure and track their progress. So excited for the conversation, looking forward to going into more detail. The only other thing that I would add is our effort is intentionally called Zoning for Housing, Housing for All. As part of each of the 8 policies, we did an equity analysis and we use data. We have kind of an equity mapping tool where we look at vulnerability indexes across the city, from poverty to educational attainment, to other things related to anti-displacement, and have used that as a way that we can set kind of a clear goal for the types of policies we want to see, but also how we will measure ourselves moving forward with each of these policies to really see how are we advancing our housing goals and how are we making sure that those housing options are available for all people, especially those who need it most in our community.
Maybe we can go to Chris next. Thank you.
You bet. Thank you, Rob, and thanks to our panelists. What a great intro by Alyia. That I would say, I'm Chris Dorrington. I'm the chair of the Governor's Housing Task Force in Montana. That housing task force was initiated in July of 22, which resulted in reports and recommendations to both the executive and our legislative branches on things that could be considered and then passed into law or operated differently on the executive side. The COVID really set the stage for people wanting to move to a rural state. We have a beautiful state. You're welcome at any time. And what that did is enable a mobile workforce, and boy, did people move here. We're seeing growth rates in some communities, year-over-year growth rates at 8 to 9%, which placed our economy and our sustaining demand for housing at a pace that we hadn't seen. So in order to sustain that housing situation and continue to provide for those moving here and those that are trickling up through the system, we established this housing task force to look at the regulatory barriers and also the needs within each of the jurisdictional areas, from local to county to state, and then beyond in the private sector, what we could all do to come together to find solutions. What we ended up doing was passing in the 23 session legislation that both funded existing infrastructure extensions, removing limitations on lot size, parking setbacks, and providing for additional dwelling units, and making mandatory a requirement for our largest communities to move through a growth planning process. Most had, but not all did. And there's a requirement for a 5-year update for everyone. I'll say that there is some pushback for a state-driven approach. Some of the localities felt that there was too much pressure, too much authority, too much requirement at the state level for localities to adhere to. But being the chair of the Housing Task Force, I can assure you that each community in Montana and the affected parties shared the need equally that housing needed to improve and increase, and that the supply demand curve needed to balance and flatten out. We have some communities where median home prices are $800,000. And so even someone with a very lucrative position can hardly afford to live in some of our communities, and that's not sustainable. And it trickles down to those families, beginning families, single individuals. We've made a tremendous improvement in our supply profile as a result of our legislation, as well as a result of our regulatory streamlining process. We took a very hard look at our own processes within our own state agencies and local government approval processes that were once waterfall and are now moving toward more of a concurrent process for approval and review. And with that, I would say, just in closing, you might think that just because Montana is a rural state, we still have space and affordability, but this is not the case. And the housing issues from a rural state to an urban state, I've been doing this now for a few years, are very, very similar. Price, availability, quality, and really that offering in order to value the humans that need to be in homes. That's not a rural urban issue, it's a human issue. So with that, I'd move on and take questions as we go. Thank you.
Okay, let's go on to Ethan.
Thanks, Rob. Hi, everyone. My name is Ethan Stuckmeyer. I'm the manager of the housing division at the State of Oregon Land Use Agency, the Department of Land Conservation and Development, or DLCD. My team and I work on, or our work kind of centers on this commitment to facilitating increased housing production, affordability, and choice. And that's a term that you'll hear me say maybe a couple times throughout this panel today. But just for a little bit of context, the State of Oregon's land use planning program, if you're familiar or even if you're not, maybe is most known for its high focus on farm and forest protection through an urban growth boundary. And so the concept of an urban growth boundary permeates all of the land use planning program elements in the state for that purpose, to protect the natural beauty of the state of Oregon and the productive farmlands that are surrounding our cities. And so with that kind of in mind, you're probably thinking, well, that dense development that Portland and Eugene are known for, these huge, massive skyscrapers and these high density developments in these cities. No, obviously I'm joking about that. The state of Oregon still struggles with, the decisions about whether or not to grow up or to grow out in terms of its development patterns. When we think about that in the context of housing, we're really kind of thinking about, if there's this obligation for local governments to meet the housing needs of their community within their cities, why is it that people in Oregon are experiencing homelessness at a rate that's never been seen in the state of Oregon before? Why is the state underproducing housing to an extent that it's going to take us decades to get out of the shortage of housing that exists today, let alone the demand of our community? And then why is the state only still building for the large lot, low density, expensive single family detached dwellings in the urban fringe? And so, in 2019, I think is really kind of where the Oregon legislature took some of the big bites at the apple in terms of trying to increase housing production, affordability, and choice in the state. The first one of the three is, in 2019, they took two bites. The first one, HB 2001, which is House Bill 2001, which created my job, but more importantly made Oregon the first state in the nation to effectively ban the practice of zoning large swaths of our communities for the sole purpose of building single-family detached dwellings. And instead, those local governments are now required to allow the development of middle housing, which is duplexes, triplexes, quadplexes, cottage clusters, and townhouses, anywhere that formerly the city zoned only for single-family detached dwellings. And to boot, those local governments can't apply standards to that allowance that would cause unreasonable cost and delay to the development of middle housing. That's definitely like a housing choice approach. The other one in 2019 was House Bill 2003, which kind of took a different approach. more systemic approach to reforming the housing planning program. So this added a new dimension to the housing planning program in the state of Oregon that asks cities to commit to a game plan, a set of actions over the next 6 or 8 years, depending on the city size, to actually meet their other communities' housing needs. And so those are not just zoning and land use policies, but things like removing additional regulatory barriers to housing, say for the provision of infrastructure, or providing financial resources to development particular types of housing, or investing in public and private partnerships. And then thirdly, the other major reform that I'm hoping to talk about today is more recent, also very confusingly titled House Bill 2001, but from a different legislative session. Just last year in 2023, the state of Oregon took an entire reform approach to that planning process and said, let's move the goalpost in terms of what types of housing we should actually be planning for in our communities, and with a specific focus on housing for providing people with additional options for folks who traditionally have not had those options. And so really kind of setting the frame and tracking progress towards those housing production goals as a state. And so really you can kind of see those three things. You can see production, affordability, and choice in those kind of three major reforms. Middle housing being obviously the choice element of that, housing production strategy being the production part of that, and then the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis from 2023 being kind of the affordability side and planning for affordability as an intentional approach to planning. So looking forward to talking about all of those in the next couple minutes here.
Okay, thank you very much, Ethan. Casey?
Hi, thanks, Rob. Good morning, everyone. I'm Casey Downey. I'm a long-range planner with the city of Spokane over here in Washington. And Washington and Spokane have done a number of housing reforms, but I really wanted to highlight our work that we've been calling Building Opportunity for Housing. In July of 2022, the city of Spokane adopted an emergency interim ordinance to serve as sort of a pilot program. We had already issued a housing emergency declaration. We have seen housing costs just increase substantially in just a number of years, the median price going from around the 200s to being in the 400s and continuing to rise. We're seeing a huge growth in our population. We're seeing a large increase in our unhoused population. So we realized with all of these changes, we couldn't continue doing small changes with our zoning regulations. So that interim ordinance immediately allowed up to 4 units on all residential lots and made some adjustments to our development code. And then we immediately went into a robust community engagement process to solidify what those regulations will look like permanently. We talked to residents about what they needed in housing, and more importantly, we talked to them about what they actually cared about when new housing was being built next to them. We also talked to developers to identify any additional barriers that may be in place. And then the new permanent regulations went into effect in January 1st of this year. And those regulations included removing density maximums for all residential units less than 2 acres in size, removing parking minimums for all residential units within a half mile of any transit stop. We reduced lot sizes and setbacks. We made some adjustments to our unit lot subdivision to help encourage and make more feasible homeownership with some of those housing units we're hoping to see. And we also implemented building maximum footprints and design standards to kind of bridge a balance between this increased intensity and the form that the community wanted to see. So we're still tweaking, and we're continuing to look for additional ways to improve our housing regulations, because there's not one code change that's going to fix the housing issues we're seeing across the country. So looking forward to this conversation to kind of see what everyone else is doing as well.
Wow. Thank you, Casey. And what's really amazing is sort of the variety of approaches we're hearing addressing the housing issue. A lot of them do focus on sort of removing the barriers to letting housing be built, but others are more making investments or figuring out how to increase production of housing. A lot of these efforts are quite new. I mean, it seems like as I go around the room, a lot of the things have really happened in the last couple of years, and these things take a while to get going. And I'm wondering if we can start off by just talking about what you see as being sort of the most effective in terms of getting an immediate effect, a more immediate effect on the housing supply. If anybody's got any thoughts on that.
So since we implemented kind of the emergency ordinance to really kickstart our development code right away, I'll speak on that. We really took the stance of we need to make changes now. When you're making significant code changes, that can be years of work. And it was years of work that we didn't feel like we could keep waiting for. So we did the emergency ordinance to immediately make those regulations. It was a slow uptick. It was a lot of educating people about these new regulations, what middle housing was, educating developers and stock plan developers, kind of what they can now build. Between July of 2022 and October of the next year, which is when we were kind of monitoring the unit count for the interim ordinance, we had 76 units go through permitting. We had another about 450 go through the pre-development process. And a number of those, even now with the permanent changes coming in, they've invested. So we're still seeing an uptick in units come in. So we did notice kind of immediate change to kind of, hey, we can make these housing units work, but it did take some education, and it's still a slow uptick. We're still working on educating with the new regulations, convincing some developers that this is a housing type. The middle housing is something that people are wanting to live in. So it's a lot of education we're still working on, but we did see some immediate changes just by getting rid of some of those barriers.
I guess what I would just offer up, I can't say that we are seeing the immediate impact that Casey described, but I can tell you a lesson learned from just how you folks might approach these efforts. Initially, when we did our housing master plan, we identified 13 different policies. And the council at that time had set up a process where each year we were going to look at a different policy. So, we started with ADUs, then we went to a co-living policy, then we went to accessory dwelling policy. And by the time I got on council, what we were hearing from the community, from those who were opposed, they would say, this is death by 1,000 cuts. They're like, every few months, we're picking up another policy. And every time you tell us it's supposed to do something for our housing system, and why do we have to do a next one every once in a while? From the advocates, we were hearing, this is going to take forever. This is 13 years by the time we're going to get through all of this. And by then there will probably be new policies. And so it was a big shift for us to actually combine them into more of an omnibus legislation. So I would say, while it didn't mean that the next day we started seeing things, it definitely then accelerated our conversation to be able to look at the connectiveness between what does a functional housing ecosystem need, and how do you think about those policies together in order to pass something that then is more predictable for residents, but also for developers who want to take up these policies. They understand the various options available to them and how they might combine these tools to actually help move a project forward in a way that they might not have been able to before.
And that was the 8 housing points. Chris, you had your hand up. You wanted to say something?
Sure. I think there are a couple of points. I don't think any of us have solved the problem, right? So it's an emerging issue. It'll continue to be an issue, but we're all really striving to make those incremental improvements. One of the really, I would say, not glamorous improvements we've made, but really impactful improvements is adding a handful of reviewer staff, but then training, just as Casey had said, training and teaching the process throughout all of the affected stakeholders. So our reviewers, our developers, our engineers and consultants are now in across the state. We're increasing the training component in order to advise and inform, even in advance of a development, trying to do pre-application meetings, and identify areas that might be sticking. We've done that, and that process improvement, and in addition to what I had opened with in the concurrent process reviews with the locals, has really resulted in housing developments quicker in the ground and up, and then occupiable. So,
I did want to ask you, Chris. It seems like Montana has adopted something, and correct me if I'm wrong. It's like a smorgasbord of choices that municipalities can make to address the housing. So it's not necessarily saying you have to do this, you have to do that, but here are your choices, and you got to pick from these choices.
yes. So we offered 15 options. They have to employ 7 or 8 of the 15. Trust me, when you say you have to still pick, actually, I think it's 4, but we're looking to increase the number of required from the full list. Even when you say you have to have 4 out of 15, people still feel that's a requirement that's too heavy or burdensome. I would just say that. But it was meant to provide a menu of options that fit the character and the economic state of each of the communities so that they could still implement a scenario that worked for them. One of the very clear pieces of feedback that we've received is communities feel a real sense of character and wanting to sustain themselves as a very important part of their history. And so simply saying you must increase density or you must allow for ADUs feels like a heavy hand. Even in one of the questions, we took a you must improve and increase density approach, which in a state that has space has available fringe building room, the maximum benefit to the lowest cost home for a new home buyer, even in the middle, is to increase density using existing infrastructure or extending existing infrastructure. And we provided a funding option in order to do that that's completely built out. I mean, and the funding we allowed has already been gobbled up in no time. And that's infrastructure improvement as a carrot to buy down door count cost.
Are you seeing some of the choices become, very popular immediately? Or are the communities coalescing around any of those options?
I think definitely the growth planning piece. I think we'll have emerging acceptance. I wouldn't say that anyone has leapt to the front, cheering the requirement to growth plan. So I'll be clear about that. But like Casey said, there's this rolling acceptance and improvement of acceptance of those options, and I think they will take and bear fruit here soon.
And Ethan, Oregon is one of the first states to really do a statewide housing reform for missing middle and address parking requirements, I believe, statewide. What kind of impact are you seeing from that?
Yeah, so the context there is the middle housing law, House Bill 2001 from 2019, required that local governments must allow these middle housing types, but they couldn't apply standards that cause what's called unreasonable cost or delay. And so one of the questions that we posed in that process was, well, how do you define what's unreasonable? And so one of the ways that we did that is to instead define what is reasonable. Trying to pair that with what do cities already apply to single family detached homes in that same zoning district, and saying you can't really apply standards that are more rigorous, more strenuous, more strict than what you allow for single family detached homes in that same zone. And so one of those sticking points, though, was parking in particular, about how many off-street parking spaces could be required for each of these middle housing types. And so that's one of the areas of, as a state, you have the ability to kind of, play around with some of those policy decisions. And I think Oregon took, an approach to say there is an upper limit here. Like, we know there's data that shows there's an upper limit. There's an additional cost to providing additional parking offsite. and that plays with the geometry of the site, and all of these reasons why not having this big sea of parking is going to be beneficial for housing production and affordability. And so Oregon took the approach of really putting an upper cap on how many off-street parking spaces a local government could require for middle housing type. Really, it depends on the housing type and the size of the lot, but really it kind of boils down to one parking space per unit in a middle housing development. And so, that's a huge pivot for a lot of local governments. And one of the things that I think was really useful from HB 2001 in terms of that regulatory approach was a lot of cities were kind of already thinking about middle housing and trying to figure out how to incentivize it before the legislation. But to get buy-in and implementation across the state, that would have taken decades, if ever. Those other cities who don't have that same development pressure in that particular way to, as compared to Portland or Eugene or Salem or any of those cities, to get them to the point where they're allowing these housing types. And so HB 2001 expedited that work and expedited the conversation about reducing parking mandates. And it served a really value because of that approach in particular. There's a whole bunch of things that kind of flow from that, as we've seen in more recent legislation and using a very similar type of approach. But I think that was kind of the genesis, or at least the catalyst, for some of this major change and kind of quote unquote unlocking development potential across the state.
I did want to talk about the parking mandates issue. It's one thing to say that it's legal to do missing middle housing in any municipality or statewide, but there's all kinds of things that can still prevent you from doing missing middle housing. And it could have to do with setbacks or lot coverage requirements or lot size. But the parking is one that really does affect the ability to build missing middle and a lot of other housing types. There are a few municipalities in New Jersey that have reformed their parking, but I know there's a lot more that haven't. And so could anybody on the panel kind of explain, why parking is so important for affordable housing? Thoughts from Casey or Alyia?
Yeah, I can go. As I noted, Spokane has removed all parking minimum requirements for any residential use within the city, so long as it's within a half mile of any transit stop. And that's basically the entire city. There's some outlying areas that don't have the transit system support, but by and large, no parking is currently required for any residential units in the city. And that was because one of the main things we kept hearing was parking is causing an issue. Parking is either just not feasible. The asphalt square for a parking spot costs a lot when you're looking at the development costs of a project. So either it was a cost issue, or adding in parking meant they couldn't add in more units. It was trying to fit everything within a box. And if you required an X number of parking per unit, you automatically were reducing how many units could be built. So with these changes, we are noticing that a lot of market rate developers are still building some parking. Parking isn't disappearing or going away. We're really just giving an option for the target audience for the developer, trying to look at the type of residents that they're hoping to rent or sell to. So market rate, we're seeing some parking. They may be reducing a little bit, but affordable housing development is really where we're seeing the lack of parking requirements pay off. A lot of the affordable housing developers are saying, a lot of our residents don't have vehicles, or a lower percentage of our residents have vehicles. So this was wasted space. And now by getting rid of the parking on their development, we are increasing the number of units that can be built. We're reducing the cost of just pavement, and we're really letting the projects pencil out by having more units, spreading out that cost. So it is primarily working for specifically affordable housing developers.
Great. Thank you very much, Casey. Um, one of the thoughts that I have is that there's when you're really trying to increase the housing supply in a municipality or a state, there's a couple of there's two different approaches that I'm seeing, and one is to kind of you try to allow for more density on a lower scale throughout entire cities through the missing middle approach, and say you're no longer going to have 70% of your city zoned for single family housing. You're also going to be able to build duplexes, triplexes, townhouses, whatever. Another approach is to look at particular areas of cities with services, particularly along transit corridors, and say we're going to try to develop a lot of density on these small areas of the cities that have access to transit or in corridors where there's a lot of room to develop. So these are kind of two different approaches. And I wanted to ask a little bit about, what you thought were the potential for each of these. If anybody who wants to respond to that.
I'll go first. Just on what we did, we passed legislation 23 as part of our housing package that any home lot that was single living housing could be built as a duplex or triplex. And so I think our approach in some is an efficient, opportunistic model that allows the market to respond. And so we're more of the first than the second model.
Okay. Alyia?
I guess I would just say in Alexandria, we really see the value of both. I think recognizing, and someone was talking about this earlier, that, you do have unique neighborhoods and every neighborhood wants to figure out kind of what's going to work best for them, but also making sure that every neighborhood is contributing to the larger goal. So in our zoning for housing package, one policy is focused on incentivizing transit-oriented development. We're not a big city, but we do have several metro stops. We have been investing in bus rapid transit corridors. And so making sure that any development near those areas, we are providing density bonuses or other types of incentives to get housing there. In our single family zones, we also realize that that's about 30% of our city. And in order for them to be able to contribute to our larger housing goals, it might require a different type of model. So through our zoning for housing, we now allow duplexes, triplexes, and up to quadplexes. And then we did do a reduction in the parking requirements for each of those types of models.
Okay.
I think the Oregon approach was to cast a wide net, very similar to what I'm hearing Chris say in Montana. And I think that was kind of born out of a ideal or a thought about like kind of a values statement about like why are we preserving particular areas of our city in this amber of being exclusionary to a point where you can only build one type of development, which is the most expensive type of development. And so why are we maintaining those and perpetuating that kind of approach, and why not allow the opportunity to let the market decide on what's going to be able to be built in those particular areas? And so saying very similar to the Montana approach, everywhere a single family detached unit is allowed, that same allowance is afforded to middle housing anywhere in the city.
Are you seeing any problem with the capacity of the development community? Maybe they're not used to building missing middle housing,
Absolutely.
Yeah.
100%. And what we're seeing is actual margin problems. So we've had builders that can build they can build nice margin guaranteed homes, single family on the fringe, where higher density homes require a different kind of, a little bit different building style. So moving the market and the labor to a higher density approach has been pretty significantly challenging. the labor cycle is it's a very two-edged sword. You need labor to build homes, but you need homes to have labor. And that has been a very significant issue that we've faced.
I wanted to ask Casey a little bit about the pre-approved house designs, because this is very new and we're not really sure how well this is going to work, but it's a very attractive idea. Could you explain a little bit about what Spokane is doing with pre-approved housing and why that's promising?
Yeah, absolutely. So, this also feeds into there's not one answer to our housing issues. We need to kind of throw everything at the wall. First, we change our zoning regulations, and then we need to figure out something else. So, our design review project team is really working on these pre-approved plans. So there's an ADU, there's a duplex, a triplex. I believe we also have a fourplex, trying to get plans that can be purchased at a reduced rate that have been pre-approved by our building and engineering groups. So it's a quicker review process. Quicker review process equals cheaper development process. And there's a guarantee that these projects meet the requirement. We are running into some barriers with that. Middle housing's new. Not every profession is used to middle housing. So we're having to figure out how engineering and building are reviewing these housing types. So we're still actually working through that. We don't have any pre-approved plans yet, but we're still moving it forward. And while we're waiting for those to be successful, we're not just waiting. We are also working on a housing guidebook to help people understand what middle housing is. So, okay, we have this idea of pre-approved plans that may work in the future, but until then, here's this guidebook. This is what a site plan is. This is how you can arrange a site plan to fit more units. This is the type of landscaping that you'll need to consider, kind of a one-stop shop of understanding the regulations. We also created a team called the Middle Housing Support Team that works through plans that developers have created. So we do kind of a mini pre-approval of these plans. We're reviewing them before they're finalized, identifying any red flags that aren't working with that project. So we're kind of trying to fill that gap right now of pre-approving plans that developers have made or stock plan groups have made while we're waiting for those official pre-approved plans. So I think it's promising. You're reducing the risk, essentially, of those pre-approved plans once they're in place. We're reducing time and cost. So we're still working towards that. It's just taking a little bit longer because middle housing isn't new. Historically, we've built it, but it's not what we've been building lately. So we're still having to work through kind of those kinks to figure out how to make everyone work together to make that a reality.
We're going to go to some questions from the audience. And I want to remind everybody that if you do have questions, please put them into the Q&A function of Zoom. And we get a question, can you share examples of how you've worked with local school boards to make facility upgrades, expansions to support additional housing in your communities? Many NIMBY arguments center around the capacity issues in schools, and it's often a valid concern. In New Jersey, local government is separate from the Board of Education. Any thoughts on that? Okay, Alyia.
Sure, I'm happy to go first on this one. We face the same conversations here. I can tell you I'm actually in the middle of an election cycle and I've been on the doors and people will say, well, are you for housing or are you for schools? Because we are seeing schools that are at capacity. We're seeing overcrowding. Some of the ways that we have started to change the conversation and work more closely with our elected school board is first and foremost, it begins with our staff. So we have our planning and zoning department at the beginning of each year when they're doing our forecasting and sort of looking at population trends and demographics. They also meet with members of our school system to look at their enrollment projections as well. We've also added into every one of our dockets that we receive for each development process. There's now a section focused specifically on the schools, where we look at and we use a formula to calculate how many students are projected to be generated by this development. It also looks at what schools they would feed into and identifies what the current capacity of those schools are. The third way is kind of just through the elected bodies. We've started now having work sessions with the school board and the council, where we are looking at our capital improvement plan and really trying to understand where's the growth coming from, what are we seeing, how then do we budget and prepare for additional capacity in terms of new schools or modernizations of existing schools. I think the other thing that I would just throw out there is a lot of times people will try and associate it and say it's just the new density that's creating this challenge. In our city specifically, what we're seeing is it's actually not the new buildings that are generating a lot of students. What is happening is much of our older housing stock that's like 50 years old, 45 years old, that is what is still affordable. And so you're seeing issues of overcrowding. You're seeing many more families that, what used to be a 1-bedroom is now housing 6 or 7 people. And so we are trying now to have a different conversation, that it's not just about new density. It's about kind of why that density is important to actually take some of the pressure off our other housing stock, and to make sure that everyone has a safe and affordable home, because when that's not addressed, that creates other school issues as well and prevents our young people from being able to take advantage of even the best classroom or the best lesson, because of the housing situations they're facing.
If I could share a little anecdote or a little piece, we didn't work directly with schools in the creation of this policy. However, I want to distinguish an important piece of this policy is that the allowance for middle housing is just that, an allowance of middle housing. A property owner can apply to build or propose to build middle housing. So that is a different conversation at the local government level in terms of permitting that development type. And so that's, if you're a planner, you know that there's a huge difference between allowance and permitting. And so, that permitting conversation is more about, all of those infrastructure, schools, elements come into play in that local government decision-making process about whether or not they can actually permit that development. But you have to allow it. You have to allow the opportunity. You have to allow the property owner to make the case for that development. But that permitting decision is still at the local level.
Thank you. We get a question from Nicole. Car dependency and suburban sprawl with the accompanying high costs are intricately linked. Moving to more dense housing requires pulling back on the idea of car dependency. How closely are city planners in your area working with transit and transportation planners in making sure dense housing is also paired with mass transit? Excellent, well-put question. Any thoughts? Casey or Alyia? Alyia, I'm sorry.
Sure. Spokane's a little behind when it comes to rapid transit or having a good transportation infrastructure. We have a great bus system. Spokane Transit Authority works hard to get stops in line, but our first bus rapid transit opened last year. And we're working on a second one. So we've been working with the regional transportation groups. We have been working on a transit-oriented development project with the newly opened bus rapid transit. But what we're doing is we're focusing higher intensity along that line. We see there's a distinct difference between middle housing and high intensity that supports transit. So it's really two conversations when we're looking at our development regulations. Is middle housing is allowed by right throughout the city because it's not high intensity. It is small scale. It fits in our neighborhoods. Higher intensity along our bus rapid transit, getting that mixed use, getting larger apartment, getting the more urban form development along transit. Kind of a separate development process that we're working through. So we're just trying to keep those separate to not have the perception that middle housing is higher intensity.
Okay. Other thoughts on combining Yes, Alyia.
Sure. So I mentioned previously that part of the way we identified some of the housing reforms we wanted to push forward was through our housing master plan. As part of our housing master plan conversations, we also identified that the second highest expense for many of our families is transportation related costs in our city. And so we started engaging around the same time on an update of our Alexandria mobility plan, which was really looking at how do people move across our city? How do we accelerate investments in transportation, but also how do we look at efforts related to bike and pedestrian safety as well? And so we've tried to bring those conversations together and look at sort of how do any of our reforms also advance the mobility goals that we have? Where's the connectivity between those two plans? And then I'd say on top of that, there's a third level, which is our environmental action plan. We also started working on that at the same time. And so we have really been looking at the intersection between these three of housing, climate, and transportation. And so there are other efforts now happening. For example, our public transportation, our Dash bus, is now free. And so it may not come up as part of the zoning conversation, but it is through these other conversations and being intentional about those connections that we're using our budget or other policy decisions to kind of help with the success of our housing by making sure that our residents are connected to, job centers, other services and supports that they need to be able to do well in our community.
Great. Of course, all of this is affected by the economy. And one thing that we've seen is, higher interest rates in the last year or two. And we have a question from Daniel. Higher interest rates for construction projects and for mortgages have dampened housing availability. How will these new policies play out in a lower interest rate environment? Do you anticipate an acceleration of new housing, providing interest rates do drop down? Any thoughts on that, or how?
I can address part of that. I think from my perspective, any additional home allows, especially in volume. So we have one builder that I met with as a case study. They're adding 800 new homes in one subdivision. They're targeting the second step home, so not the entry level home, but that what I anticipate is that second level home will free up rental units as the renters move to their second home. While still at a high price point, that additional supply allows some flexibility, some elasticity in the market. I don't think that one case study is going to affect the macroeconomic factors of interest rates. I think that's way too big for any one group or one state to impact. But I do think, as I've traveled quite a bit across the United States this year, and there's building going on almost everywhere. So as supply comes online, I'm hoping that those home costs come down, which then trickle back into interest rates and hopefully affect some of those macros.
Has the changes in interest rates, has it really affected the efforts of your jurisdictions to encourage missing middle housing in particular? Do you see an impact? In the state of Oregon, how is that going, Ethan?
Good question. I don't actually have any data to back that up or whether to say definitively, but anecdotally, I guess, just for what it's worth, we are hearing from local governments. The state of Oregon has, DLCD is that's our constituents, the cities, and so we hear all the time questions coming in about development proposals and how to work through sticky issues and all that kind of stuff. And I would say that those questions that we're receiving correlate to how many development proposals they're actually seeing in their local governments. And that amount of questions that we've been receiving has not decreased and has only increased, pretty substantially over time. And so I think that shows that there's still lots of development happening in terms of middle housing in the state of Oregon in particular. But I'm not a builder, but I do know that how pro formas work, and if the cost of materials and loans and all that kind of stuff is increasing, and you still want to build affordable housing, the cost of those standards and actually meeting the requirements of the city needs to move, or the price needs to go up. And if we want to keep the price the same, some of those other things need to be reduced. So
Chris asks, do any of the presenters have experience creating an administrative approval process, a zoning permit for creating housing rather than the longer public hearing process, site plan? If so, how has this impacted development of housing? I mean, have you generally changed the process for approving the housing and maybe tried to streamline it in any of your jurisdictions?
The one primary way I would just say is permit by right, which is single family for multifamily. The process is I think it's too risky to do it administratively, where you still have protections in place that have to be checked through, whether it's environmental or financial protections. But I'd let the others address others. Permit by right's big one for us.
Okay. In Alexandria, have you done this or?
We have not yet. It is something we are going to be exploring. We actually, our local chamber, they put together a legislative agenda every year, figuring out ways to permit and streamline and accelerate our permitting is actually one of the things they've put forth as a top goal, as well as our Housing Affordability Commission. I think the way that we are going to be looking at this is through our planning and zoning work plan, and we've asked them to come to us with some examples of where this might make sense. And how it would be implemented and tracked, but we haven't done anything just yet.
I suppose that the pre-approved concept of house designs could be called an administrative approval process.
Oregon's actually tackled this head on in terms of trying to reduce that regulatory process, which is to require that all residential development applications receive or have the opportunity to go through what's called a clear and objective review process. And so, removing all discretion as much as possible from that decision-making process to ensure that those decisions aren't always going to a planning commission or aren't always going to city council, where, that can really gum up the works, and try to leave some of those decisions as much as we can at the staff level, so we can quickly move through those decisions. And then even more recently, trying to bring not housing development procedures to kind of that clear and objective process, but also things like subdivisions or land partitions or lot partitions or those kind of things towards that clear and objective pathway, where there's not actually a whole lot of discretion that the local government can have in that process. And that removes the need for a neighborhood meeting and all that kind of stuff, because those decisions are just, you either meet the metric or you do, or you don't for approval.
We have a question from Tom. Could Chris talk about how in Montana liberals and libertarians coalesce to find agreement, and what lessons can be shared in New Jersey?
Sure. I think the first part is working outside of a strictly political lens is really important. So adding a multi-stake, multi-policy and political view inside the work group. So our task force is made up of, I think, 27 different stakes, but that includes the legislative branch, the executive branch, private industry, local governments, and all come with a different political lens. We intentionally brought in 2 Democrats and 2 Republicans into the housing task force. And I'll re-emphasize what I'd said before, just every community, regardless of red or blue or green, pick a political party. Every community is saying, can you please help us with housing? And so having an outcome-based approach that improved both the delivery process, one, the awareness of the housing concerns, the delivery process of the housing, and then through following through in the legislation that delivers on the outcome-based approach. It's really hard, despite people holding to their political values, it's really hard to argue that communities and citizens, humans who need homes, would be barred from efficient and effective government based simply on a political viewpoint or a vote or agreement based on their political view. Humans need homes. We view this as an American right, a right to housing that is safe and stable. And so tying into that value stream and our outcome-based approach of increasing housing supply, we were able to really bring together pretty much anyone who had a say and had a voice in a vote in the end on legislation in order to improve that outcome.
Now, I know, Alyia, you have to leave soon, possibly, but there is a question that, Alexandria is all infill, essentially. And the question had to do with, much of New Jersey is really about infill or redevelopment. And to what extent have your policies been successful in producing missing middle housing as infill? I know that your more recent policies are probably too new, but if you could speak to that issue a little bit.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. Alexandria, we're only about 15.2 square miles. So we are pretty limited in what we are able to do. I would say, as was mentioned, a lot of the missing middle stuff we haven't really, it was just passed in November. So we're starting to see what will be the uptick there. Where we have seen some interesting things happening is several years ago, the council passed an ADU policy. For a city of our size, I think our planners predicted that we'd see about 10 a year. The first year after that policy was passed, I think we did see about 15 to 20. Now we are seeing closer to that 10 number. I'd say we are also starting to see some areas where communities are starting to put forth some proposals and ideas to subdivide lots or to put forth some additional ideas. But it's really pretty new for us. Where we've focused on more has been like the last areas of land where we have sort of much larger tracts to really see how we could do something transformative. We call them our coordinated development districts, but trying to see where we can do a lot more vertical than we might be able to do in some of these smaller areas. So I look forward to updating you as we see these policies get taken up and implemented. And I do apologize, I have to sign off, but I thank you for your time. I thank you for your questions, and I'm happy to share my information to continue the conversation, and just glad to be able to be a part of this really great panel with so many leaders across our country.
Thank you, Alyia. We have a question about about historic preservation. Many opponents of increasing density or building affordable housing utilize the historic preservation process to slow things down and put up roadblocks. Are there any strategies for dealing with this, and how do you balance the actual need to preserve truly historic buildings? Do you see this as a conflict, historic preservation and building more housing?
So I started in historic preservation, so I'm going to try and not get on my soapbox here, but equitable historic preservation and housing affordability come hand in hand. Middle housing and historic preservation come hand in hand. You can't buy or rent cheap if you just built something. It's going to be more expensive. Smaller units, middle housing units are going to be more attainable than a new detached single family home, but they're still going to be more expensive. They're new. We rely on existing buildings to provide some of that affordable housing. And historic buildings, a lot of them tend to be smaller. They tend to be those affordable housing. I'm currently sitting in a 660 square foot home built in 1949. That is historic preservation or historic buildings providing a house that I was actually able to magically buy. They go hand in hand. Historic preservation has been used as a tool to try and stop development. But when we look at a lot of our historic neighborhoods, they have cottage houses or ADUs. They have duplexes. They have manors that had multiple apartments. When we talk about historic preservation, we have to break down kind of the tool it's trying to be used as and look at what historic preservation is. That's keeping smaller homes keeping existing homes that have already been built so they're more affordable, and keeping that, the options of stock available. And I know I started rambling there, so I'm going to get off my soapbox, but there's definitely not a conflict there if done equitably.
We have a question about the suburbs and any information on reducing parking and car dependency in suburban communities. It's obviously a much different situation in the suburbs from the historic places with a historic street grid, where you might have access to transit, where you might much be have fewer needs for parking and be able to develop more densely. What are your thoughts for suburban areas in reducing car dependency and getting higher density missing middle housing in those places? Ethan or Chris?
I think the one approach that we've taken is just incentivizing financing for infrastructure investment to buy down door count costs inside existing communities. And so I think I can only speak to the fringe of the question, but if you're providing an incentive for a builder to build within and then asking for them to build higher density homes, I think the margins work and the market will respond that way. And then thus you remove that suburban fringe and suburban sprawl piece where you're gonna have to invest in them anyway. But you got better bang for your buck by pushing a little bit more density in some of the communities. And coincidentally, this is one of the other questions that was asked on NIMBYism that we had faced with our package. Some folks don't like increased density from a neighborhood that's been only so dense before, and we've seen opposition in that to that. Even the notion of improving density and removing some of the barriers and costs of fringe development.
I think there's an interesting equity conversation that gets wrapped into this question about, the suburbs are built in a way that really serve a certain type of people. That doesn't mean that folks don't want to live there if they don't have a car, right? It becomes more difficult. But why are we, just by the nature of the way that community is built, precluding somebody from having the option to live in those communities near good schools, near parks, near those open spaces? And so, from a regulatory perspective or like a policy perspective, why not afford the opportunity for a builder to come in and build an ADU in that community with no parking for somebody to, come into that community and really kind of thrive and be resilient and, figure their way? Why are we presupposing that person who, may not have a car cannot live in that community because they don't have ready access to transit? I just think that's a false dichotomy.
Suburban areas also tend to have like tremendous amounts of underutilized land, and specifically large parking areas that are not necessarily all occupied or all needed. And they have services and utilities, and they could be developed for an increased density. We have a question on how you folks navigate the lack of staffing and lack of planning funding by in communities. You have some cities where you have significant planning staff, but especially if in states like Oregon, Montana, you have a lot of smaller communities which don't have the planning staff to maybe pivot and come up with these new concepts. What are you doing about that?
I can go first, Ethan, if you want. What we provided in 2023 was a funding package that allowed for applicants of the requirement to do growth planning to receive funding in order to help them perform that growth funding. Somewhat sadly, I'd have to say the growth planning estimates coming back from consultants that serve communities that don't have their own planners is exorbitant. I mean, it is so expensive. And I think, and it's probably wrought from history, right? These are highly contested plans, lots of iterations, lots of requirements and considerations that go well beyond just the traditional, how can we build more homes? You have all sorts of considerations that need to go into that conversation, and then ultimately end in a growth policy and plan that fits that character and that community. So I think we'll be looking at in 2025 additional funding to allow and help some of these communities to develop their own growth plans.
Yeah, and in the passage of House Bill 2001 in 2019, I think one of the questions in the chat is about like who are the groups that were opposed to middle housing, and one of those groups, for better or worse, is the lobby of cities, the League of Oregon Cities, about this is a heavy burden. We don't have the staff, we don't have the capacity, the time. We have to get the water bills out. Like that's our focus. And so, to their good credit, they were able to convince the legislature to include a pretty substantial technical assistance grant funding package as part of the passage of that bill, so that the agency DLCD could provide consultant support either directly or through some sort of master agreement with a consulting group to boost that capacity, to support local governments to go through that work. And then that continues on into the future, not just for the rollout of that policy, but also the implementation as well. And so that's been a huge piece of the success, I guess, if we could call it a success, of Oregon's middle housing law, about continued support, direction, eyes on the cities in terms of helping them go through this process, because otherwise they're out on an island. They have too many things on their plate to try to do that without the support of the state.
Mm-hmm. And in Spokane, you essentially declared a housing emergency, and the planning staff was expected to do a lot of things in a short period of time, right? I mean, step up some processes, and it might take years and do them in months, or, how did all that work out?
Yeah, so with our housing emergency and doing the interim ordinance, it was done quickly. It was ultimately the interim ordinance and those regulations was basically the full time of three of us. We wrote them. We tried to look at other jurisdictions for examples, but we threw something together that was simple and to try and surge the development right then. And then we took the year and a half process to write those permanent regulations. We were very fortunate. We have a decent size of long range planners. We could do with some more current planners. So we kind of share some duties there to try and support the review of this middle housing work. But I would like to note that while Spokane was doing this, the Washington legislature was also running through some housing work. After we did our interim ordinance, they actually passed House Bill 1110 that required jurisdictions of certain sizes to allow up to 4 units on all lots. And what they're doing with that is the Department of Commerce is creating a model ordinance. So there are some jurisdictions that don't have the capacity to use the full-time work of 3 planners to write codes. So they're creating this model ordinance that can be adopted as is or referenced to try and fill in some of that work, so it's not as much as a burden on other jurisdictions that don't have capacity. So just reiterating, state help is really important in this work.
We have a question from Peter. Do any of you provide financial incentives to get missing middle housing built, or any of the kind of housing we're talking about? Are there other incentive linkages, like they go to the front of the line for types of funding? Thoughts on the funding of this kind of housing and how you're incentivizing it?
Our initial part, I think I've talked about a little bit, and that's investing in infrastructure, extending and improving existing infrastructure in order to make connections to new multifamily homes. There's a trigger there. So if you're building multifamily or higher density homes, then you have access to infrastructure improvement money, which affects the margin for builders, which creates the incentive. That's one way. We've talked quite a bit about tax incentives or first home buyer buy down. Incentives are, especially tax credits, are pretty challenged. And just in the dialogue, when you start entering the tax arena, you garner a lot more attention and a lot more friction, and so those have been pretty difficult to get through.
Yeah, I don't work at a city, but some cities in Oregon, Bend, Portland are waiving system development charges or impact fees for things like middle housing or ADUs, if they can show that they won't become short-term rentals, which I think is a good kind of extension of that policy. But that has a follow-on effect of, that funding or that tax base or that revenue source has to come from somewhere else, right? And so the state is working with those local governments to try to backfill some of that foregone cost, or revenue from that development. But then I'll also say that I think the big piece remaining in Oregon is really infrastructure. The property tax system in Oregon doesn't facilitate cities to actually create the revenue that they need to provide those services. And so one of the big questions that's kind of remaining is, is there reform to that infrastructure finance system that's necessary to allow cities to reduce those impact fee costs, or, think about their building permit fees in a little bit of a different way to further incentivize development. But that infrastructure investment piece is definitely an emerging issue.
Part of Spokane kind of looking at getting rid of our densities is to try and increase how many projects can apply for kind of our one incentive. We have a multifamily tax exemption, which gets rid of, this is not my forte here. This is our economic development team, but it gets rid of the property taxes for that valuation of what they build for X number of years, depending on the affordable housing that they can do. And that MFTE only applies for projects that are 4 or more new units. So by allowing for however many units, we're increasing what projects may be able to apply for that program. It's not capital A affordable, but another part of us getting rid of our maximum density is when you say you get X number of units on a lot, they're going to max out those units. A developer is going to do as big of those units as they can get because they only get so many. By getting rid of the density maximum, we're seeing kind of a thought process happen where, well, if we do smaller units, we can get more units, and kind of, thinking creatively through projects more. And if we're able to get more smaller units, since we're able to allow more units, those aren't capital A affordable with subsidies, but they are more attainable price points than larger units would be. So it's not an incentive, but by allowing that flexibility, we're trying to get more of those attainable price points.
We have a question about New Jersey is losing companies providing homeowners insurance, and the ones that are remaining are raising rates. How does the panel think the issue will impact new housing starts?
We have already started this, Rob. We're looking at it. So we're in our 3rd housing task force report. It'll be coming out soon. One of the significant challenges that we've seen that has been raised is both through climate change. We've seen wildfire and flood risk go up quite a bit within our communities. Floodplains being remapped that are right through existing subdivisions, and then the urban forest interface being increasingly risky, and then the result of that, the national effect of extreme weather events affects the multinational insurance companies, which I think are becoming more constrained. Then, just as we've been talking about, the cost of building going up increases the cost or the requirement of that requisite insurance, and so we've seen rates go up. So I don't think we have a solution yet, but it's definitely something we're trying to watch for, and it's a key part of the overall cost of homeowners' budget that we're watching that.
And, another question about New Jersey has many small communities with local control. How do you increase housing supply, affordability, and transportation when you have so many small communities all having to act?
Yeah, I think this is one of those big questions that I think the Oregon legislature battles with every single year they convene about, what is how does some of these like urban issues also play out in more rural, smaller communities? And does the same solution need to happen in both places? And so there's a lot of kind of nuance. And in Oregon, there's this breaking point in cities between cities that have population 10,000 and greater and population below 10,000. These are kind of two different cohorts of cities, and they have different requirements. That's kind of the threshold for if you're like a big city if you have 10,000, and you're a small city if you have under 10,000. And so that's one of the approaches that I think the state of Oregon is intentionally taking about, in those cities below 10,000, they only have to allow duplexes on every lot, and as opposed to like all of the other types of middle housing. So there's kind of a nuanced approach to try to make sure that we're not overburdening those local governments that, either don't have the capacity resources or like market to demand those kind of development, situations. So I don't know, maybe that didn't answer the question, but.
I guess you've got to have different approaches for the different size communities, and your law does break it up in terms of like what are the requirements for larger and smaller. There's a couple of questions I think were addressed to Chris, and one was a comment that picking up on you need homes to have labor, and wanted you to elaborate on that, but also what groups in Montana are opposed to these housing reforms?
Sure. What we've seen is that with the growth phase, we don't have the labor pool especially within the specialty trades, in order to even meet the demand. So a builder could have lots of demand for building residences, but they didn't have the laborers in each phase of construction. So what we've seen is the attraction of migrant labor, people moving from state to state, from even out of the country in order to capitalize on the opportunity in some of our communities. But often that puts them in a transitory state, puts them on the street in campers, even tents. We've worked with one of our key we've worked with one of our communities that's most affected by this, and what they've chosen to do is actually embrace it a little bit, instilling a bit of very localized pride in reducing waste. So they have what that community did is actually take out waste bins. They increased police patrols just on the city ordinance of taking care of your space around your camper on the street. And then on the next level up, we're hoping that as more units come online in that community, that the whole cycle and trickle will go up, and those laborers will have an opportunity to find rental units or first-time homes and become residents and laborers in that community for an extended period of time, not having to live on the street. As you might imagine, our Montana winters are formidable, and so that's a human health situation that we don't want those people to be in.
Okay.
What was the next question? Sorry.
Well, actually, Chris Sturm has come back from New Jersey Fusion. We have to close this out.
Any last words, Rob?
Well, I just wanted to thank everybody for being part of this. This has been a really enlightening panel, and I loved the conversation and the responses. I'm sorry we didn't get to all of the questions, but it was a really lively discussion.
Yes, I totally agree. I want to thank you, Rob, for guiding the discussion, and for our speakers for sharing such detailed, practical aspects of all the things you've been doing. It's so multifaceted, and I think we have learned a lot. This is definitely going to jumpstart the conversation in New Jersey about housing reforms and how we can get more housing so people can find, good, better places to live.